Hello everyone. Today I'll be discussing my fifth game from the first Banglore Grandmaster tournament. Till now I have won all four of my games, and unfortunately this game was the first loss for me in the tournament. And I believe the biggest mistake I did in the game was I played a variation that I was not entirely sure if I could have recalled, but there were some reasons for me playing that. So let's get into the game and look in details on what happened. So I was playing from white and I started with e4, and my opponent played c5, which is the Sicilian defense. Knight f3, knight c6, and d4. So this is the variation I like to play because it's simpler, you get more control on the center, and it's easier to develop your pieces. Pawn captures, knight captures, knight f6, and knight c3. So knight f6 is kind of important here. If not knight f6, the opponent plays something like e6 or a6, then white can play c4, and this becomes a very strong, the d5 square becomes very strong for white, and the position is considered slightly better for white. Knight f6, knight c3, e5. So I had multiple options of moving the knight. I could have moved the knight back. But if you notice, the c5 pawn has already, c7 pawn has already been exchanged, and the e7 pawn has moved forward. So this square d6, it is kind of weak. So knight d to b5 was played to make sure that if my opponent did not play d6, let's say he played something like a6, I could play my knight to d6 check. The only way to save the castle right is to capture, and then I can capture. And you can see that the computer likes white's position a lot, and the reason, major reason being that the king cannot castle, and there are ways of getting the knight in and creating some kind of attack, or even pin this knight, move the knight here, and there are tricks to it. So d6 in this position was important. I could have played my knight to d5. My opponent cannot capture this pawn because knight c7 is a check and I'll win the rook. But I generally play this bishop g5 variation. So interestingly, there's this series called Queen's Gambit. And if you notice, the first game that the protagonist lost, she was white and she played this variation. So my opponent continued with a6, b5, and I captured the knight and she captured with the. If he captured with the queen, then I had knight d5, and you can see my knight has squares to jump in, and if queen moves back, then I can sacrifice my bishop for this. And queen a3 is again not a good threat because I can play c3. The queen cannot capture the knight because knight c7 is this royal fork. So again, I'll quote the Queen's Gambit. So this is entirely what's happened in the Queen's Gambit. The lady, I forgot her name. She played knight d5, and the opponent played f5, and she said, "Oh, I thought it is double pawns. They are weak, but he was attacking my center." And this is actually true. Even though the double pawns might look weak, but black can always fix them and get a better control on the center. So here I could have simply captured the pawn and then played c3 and create some space for for my knight, and developed my other pieces and played a normal game. But I had played this variation before, this time only once, and that was against Padmini Rao, who is now like within the top five women in the Indian chess. So at that time also she was very strong. She was already the national champion. And what happened in the game was I had prepared this variation and I had prepared this line called bishop takes b5, and I had actually put a lot of pressure on her in that game, and it ended in a draw, but I had a lot of initiative. But I remember that bishop b5 is a very sharp variation, and you have to know a lot of variations. And I tried recalculating most of those lines, but I think there were some variations I was not able to recall. But anyways, I thought if I can put Padmini under pressure, then maybe I can repeat the same. A very bad decision. Again, to everyone watching, if you are not confident on a variation or you cannot recall a variation, do not go into it more, especially when it's so sharp and you have to give up a piece for 2 pawns. But I think this was more of an emotional decision from my side that I sacked my bishop and rook a4. So I had seen this variation. I I knew that there was this move b4 or c4, and I got confused. So how I calculated is if I play c4, then rook takes c4. I give a check. The king moves. Queen h5. But then the rook can capture my e4 pawn and then queen h4. So everything is defended. If I play queen f5 check, then king moves back and I do not have any good movement. My opponent again has very strong attack coming out soon, and my pieces they are not coordinated properly. And I thought I- so here I thought if I play b4, it would be something similar where he can just give up the knight, rook for the knight, and still have two double bishop for a rook and pawn. And even though the material is equal, I still feel white white would come under a lot of attack very soon. It just like if I castle, I thought he can just play bishop a6 and pin my knight. And so I had this gut feeling that the right move in this position is c4 or b4, but I was not able to calculate. And I knew that if I move the wrong pawn, I might lose immediately. And while calculating, I saw this variation that I can actually give up give up one of my knights for a rook. So I felt that that position would be more playable, and I went with that. So I gave a check, king moves, that was the only square, and then I did this fork on the rook and knight. So materially here I am 1 point ahead of my opponent. So unlike the previous time where my opponent had two bishops for a rook, here I have a rook and pawn, here I have two pawns. So I have one extra point. So that is the difference. And I also felt if I somehow manage to get my knight on c3, I feel these two pawns might become strong pass pawns. But I had completely discounted my opponent's counter plays and he started with queen g5. And this move was a bit surprising to me. I had thought like he will just capture the pawn and I'll play knight c3 or castling, or maybe just try to develop the bishop and stop me from castling and I can play queen d5 or something like that. But yeah, he queen g5 was just surprise. And I did not want to castle here. There are two reasons for that. First is the rook will come on the open file and there will be attack on g2. And the other thing is after captures, this bishop can come to h3 and put pressure on the f1 square. So I played queen f3. So I'm defending both my pawns with my queen and also threatening that if you capture, I can also capture on f7. My opponent captured and How I calculated was if I capture this pawn, then bishop e7, and let's say I play knight c3, then queen captures pawn is an attack. I do long castling, then rook comes to f8, and then the rook also comes to the second rank and starts attacking. No, sorry, this was not. Queen captures bishop e7. If the knight moves back, this is what I had calculated, that queen captures rook, long castling. I cannot capture this pawn because the queen is there. But I thought if I play my rook, he can play rook f8 and then capture this pawn. So I had missed this knight d5 idea. I'm also still not sure what's happening with knight d5. Maybe let's play it and see. Knight d5, king d7. So the king has to defend the knight from the queen. Rook g1. So we capture this pawn. Okay, b4. What's happening with b4? I believe here white can actually gain a piece. Like, why is white not giving a check? Check and then just capture. Okay, d5. So maybe you can capture. Okay, I cannot because the rook is hanging. Okay, this is very, very complicated. And yeah, my calculation stopped with the rook coming to the second rank, and I thought my opponent was just winning this. So considering that, I played queen takes e4. Again, somehow if my calculation was strong enough, I might have seen this knight d5 check with my queen on c4 defending c2, but I missed that. Here he played bishop b7, and I think the threat was move the knight and again put pressure on this pawn. I saw this move h4, so since he was attacking on me, I thought maybe I'll exchange some pieces. And what's the better piece to exchange than the queen? But what I failed to realize is his queen is the major source of his attack, but my queen is the only source of my defense. So even though his prominent attacking piece is going, my only defensive piece is going, so I'll be mostly defenseless. But after h4, the queen exchange, I castled a knight to d4. Here I could have played f3, and funnily I thought if I play f3, my opponent can sacrifice his knight for the pawn and fork my rooks. So whatever I play, let's say c4, he can. And even though the pawns are equal, it might be drawish. It might, but black is the only one who would push for a win. And to be honest, I thought I knew I was in danger, but this is a either draw or loss for me. There is no way for me to win. And I thought maybe if I still keep the position a little bit tense, I might get my chance to win. And that was again a bad judgment call. If you are in this bad of a position, maybe go for the right line variation that gives you some chances of a draw. But I played rook h2, bishop h6 check. And I had calculated few variations, but I had completely missed this bishop to e4. I was more thinking like my opponent might play f5 and start attacking. But bishop c4, and I saw that there's no way for me to defend this pawn. So I had to give up my rook for the knight. So remember, I had one rook and two pawns for two pieces. So again, I'm not losing a whole exchange, but rather I'm losing a piece for two pawns, which still have some chances had my pieces not been so uncoordinated. Like you can see, my rook does not have a lot of squares to move. My knight is completely out of squares. Mhm. And Again, this is not good piece play. So b3 creating some space for my knight again. d3 so my opponent exchanged his weak pawns. So that was a double isolated pawn, and he exchanged it for a good pawn. So again, a good move by him. And I feel here his technique was just too strong. He slowly advanced his pawn, forced me to reroute my pieces, and again he's not just not allowing me to move my knight. If I move my knight, I'll lose my pawn. So rook c4 trying to defend it. He could have tried something complicated, but again he also played very simple chess where just exchange as many pieces as possible and you would win the game. f3, and I didn't want to exchange the rooks, so I captured with the pawn. In d5, I tried defending, but rook d here the threat is rook d3 and capture the rook. So I had to move the rook away. And he could have again captured my pawns, but instead he decided to exchange the pieces. So here the only way I thought of doing it draw is maybe give up all my 5 pawns for this 2 pawns and somehow sacrifice this pawn to get this one on h file, because the bishop is a dark square bishop which is opposite color of the queening square. It's a draw, but again this is like trying to ask for a piece of the moon. It's that impossible. But anyways, there's some hope, so why not continue? But again, my opponent's technique was very good. So he blocked my pawns. His king is coming in. He found a way for his king to come in. And then he just had to wait, move his bishop and wait. Whenever I queen, he can capture the queen and still his bishop would defend the pawn. And he's just waiting. If I queen, I would lose it. So I moved my king back and he just kept on capturing. He gave a check, I moved and then check with the bishop. Here king c3 would have been a draw. I could have made a queen and sacrificed it to make a stalemate, but he just played bishop b2. And at this point I resigned, because if I knew that if I move my king forward, then c1 is a queen and then there's no hope of continuing. So this was my fifth game. Not, I am not happy with the way I played. I should not have gone with bishop b5. I should have played pawn takes f5 and c3, which would have given me much better chances, I believe. And just because I had prepared a variation about 15 to 16 years ago, I don't know why I thought that would still, I could recall it, or why it would be a good idea to play a variation that didn't work. And maybe this is also a good life lesson, that you cannot just say that because in the past you had some success with something that would continue. So maybe next time try innovating. If you have some stories similar to this, put them in the comment. And if you like the video, do like and subscribe to the channel. See you till next time.